Welcome to Next, People, Science Tomorrow, and another opportunity to learn where science and technology are taking our society and humanity itself. I'm Mat Kaplan, the host of the Next series here at Southern California Public Radio. You know, we usually talk about a bright future in this series, and this time that bright future is lit by the sun. We're about to discuss the only technology that is advancing apparently as fast as computer power, and how solar power might help save us from ourselves. As usual, we've assembled an outstanding panel of experts. I'll begin introducing them in a moment, but first indulge me for a moment. Anybody recognize these? I think I bought them when I was about 11 years old. Those are solar cells, so the technology goes back a little ways. I used them to power a little fan, and then I made a little solar car that could, make it across the room if there was an awful lot of light. I was fascinated by solar cells. I still am. They're really, I still think of them as nearly magical. What's that quote? Any sufficiently advanced technology. But the great science fiction writer, Robert Heinlein, more than 70 years ago, he wrote about a human civilization that had been revolutionized by clean, abundant solar power. Now, that potential has been a very long time coming. Here is a photo from one of my favorite books. I got this as a little kid. When Man and Power was published in 1960, it featured this little vision of the future, courtesy of Bell Labs. Solar panels like this one had already started to power early satellites orbiting the Earth. Their promise seemed obvious down here below, but they were terribly inefficient, and they were anything but cheap. You'll hear this evening how very far we've come. How does solar power work? Well, the variety that you see popping up on your neighbor's rooftops is photovoltaic, or PV, just like, these little guys that I held up. Here's a 2-minute introduction to the science behind those panels, courtesy of the Department of Energy.
All right, we all know that the sun's energy creates heat and light, but it can also be converted to make electricity, and lots of it. One technology is called solar photovoltaics, or PV for short. You've probably seen PV panels around for years, but recent advancements have greatly improved their efficiency and electrical output. Enough energy from the sun hits the Earth every hour to power the planet for an entire year. Here's how it works. You see, sunlight is made up of tiny packets of energy called photons. These photons radiate out from the sun, and about 93 million miles later, they collide with a semiconductor on a solar panel here on Earth. It all happens at the speed of light. Take a closer look, and you can see the panel is made up of several individual cells, each with a positive and a negative layer, which create an electric field. It works something like a battery. So, the photons strike the cell, and their energy frees some electrons in the semiconductor material. The electrons create an electric current, which is harnessed by wires connected to the positive and negative sides of the cell. The electricity created is multiplied by the number of cells in each panel, and the number of panels in each solar array. Combined, a solar array can make a lot of electricity for your home or business. This rooftop solar array powers this home, and the array on top of this warehouse creates enough electricity for about 1,000 homes. Okay, there are some obvious advantages to solar PV technology. It produces clean energy, it has no emissions, no moving parts, it doesn't make any noise, and it doesn't need water or fossil fuels to produce power. And it can be located right where the power is needed, in the middle of nowhere. Or it can be tied into the power grid. Solar PV is growing fast, and it can play a big role in America's clean energy economy. Anywhere the sun shines.
We can thank our first guest for pointing us toward that video. He has been contributing to advancements in photovoltaic power for more than 30 years. Paul Besor was recently made director of the Materials, Applications, and Performance Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. He has helped establish labs on 3 continents, including Sandia National Laboratories, Pacific Solar in Sydney, Australia, the CSG Solar Factory in Germany, the Renewable Energy Corporation of Norway, and a PV research and development lab in Silicon Valley. Paul has been on teams that achieved world record solar cell efficiencies, And he has developed widely used software for solar cell simulation and solar cost estimations. He comes to us today from the NREL campus in Golden, Colorado. Please welcome Paul Besor.
Thank you, Matt.
Our pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us. Look, before you illuminate us regarding solar energy, would you just tell us a word or two about NREL, where you're sitting now? What is the lab's mission?
To understand NREL, you have to go back to its roots, which was actually in a place called the Solar Energy Research Institute, which was established here in Colorado way back in the 1970s as a result of the Arab oil embargoes of that period, which, by the way, were the same oil embargoes that got me interested in solar energy myself, because I had just gotten my driver's license and immediately couldn't get any gasoline for my car. So I thought maybe somebody should do something about that. It was the early 1990s that SERI, as they called it, became NREL. NREL has grown since then from being more than just solar. In particular, we have one of the largest wind energy programs in the world. That's been supplemented now by grid modernization efforts and even biomass, which is a sort of indirect form of solar energy, you might say. There's about 2,000 people here in Golden, plus about 400 students and visitors at any given time.
Looks like a beautiful place to work, too. Would you agree that we've come a long way since that, I don't think you saw the picture, but that little Bell Labs solar panel of about 55 years ago?
Well, it's about a factor of 1,000 in cost, is the way I like to think of it, which is quite an improvement. And of course, probably a factor of 1,000,000 in scale. So it hardly resembles today what it was back then.
You've got a graph, the first of these several graphics we'll have tonight to take a look at, that appears to share this good news about the future, or at least the potential future. We have it up on the screen right now. Can you tell us about these curves?
Well, first, to get your bearings on this, you need to look at the little arrow on the left axis there showing the point at which photovoltaic starts to supply 10% of the world's electricity.
So right at 2,000 there.
Yeah, that's an important point of reference there. That's 2,000 gigawatts, or 2 terawatts, if you prefer to use that terminology. You can see that the various curves, some of them don't get there, many of them do. The difference in those different curves is different models having to do with what happens over the next, really, 5 years is a critical period. We currently have a very large installed base of manufacturing around the world. A lot of it is in Asia. Prices, though, have come down a lot because of actually a bit of an oversupply condition. There's more production right now than there is demand, which is one of the reasons why solar has gotten so cheap, frankly. But a downside of that is that these companies aren't making a terrible lot of money right now, and if they continue in the current realm, they might actually peak and then drop back down. That's that lower curve. The important part of this study, though, was to say how much does the economics need to improve to get to a far, far rosier future, which you can see are the various curves that shoot up towards the top. And it turns out it's really remarkably little. It's on the order of maybe 10 or 20 cents per watt. Now, if people who aren't familiar with this might not know what that means, but if you install a system in California on your roof today, it's probably going to cost you, roughly speaking, $3 per watt to have that installed. If we can improve the economics, the reduction in the cost of manufacturing, or even in the improvement of efficiency, any of these things can increase dollars per watt. And it really doesn't take much, maybe 10% benefit, and we're actually tantalizingly close to getting on one of those exponential growth curves at this point.
I like the shape of those curves. They remind me a little bit of the old hockey stick. Maybe this is the anti-hockey stick for people who know what we're talking about there in terms of climate change. We're going to talk much more about this efficiency and what it may do for our planet and our species as the conversation progresses tonight. But I want to get our second guest up here. Some of you may have seen him quoted, those of you who see Time magazine, in last week's edition of that periodical. He was quoted in an article about a couple of gigantic solar power projects here in California. Harry Atwater is the Howard Hughes Professor of Applied Physics and Materials Science at the California Institute of Technology, right up the road, where he has been on the faculty since 1988. The Atwater Research Group website describes many of the amazing efforts underway in his labs. Google it. It's well worth taking a look, as is the NREL site. Professor Atwater also serves as the director of JCAP, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, something we'll get to toward the end of our discussion tonight. And he directs the Resnick Sustainability Institute, Caltech's largest endowed research program. His group has created new high-efficiency solar cell designs, and he gave the field of plasmonics its name, but that's a topic for another evening. He is the founding editor-in-chief of ACS Photonics, a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and serves as associate editor for the IEEE Journal of Photovoltaics. Please help me welcome Harry Atwater. Right up here.
Thanks, Matt.
You bet. Thank you very much. Welcome. Nice job, by the way, this morning on take two. I don't know if any of you heard Harry this morning on the radio. The first slide that you brought along is, I think, from the look of it, a really terrific compliment to the one that we've just seen from Paul. It seems to tell us, as I said up front, that Moore's law works for solar too.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We all know about Moore's law for electronics, and over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen just exponential growth in the power and exponential drop in the cost of electronics. And that's what the blue curve there shows. That's the cost of computing. That's declined. It's declined by orders of magnitude. So there's a lot of fine print on that slide, which I apologize for. But basically, all you need to know is that on the vertical axis, it's a log scale. And on the horizontal axis, it's a linear scale of time, from 1976 up to just about now. And what's revealing, I think, is to now compare that to photovoltaics and to the cost of oil. So if you look at oil, we all know that oil looms large in our lives every day. But on a log scale, the price of oil has stayed just where it was, with a few ups and downs. But on a log scale, it stayed just where it was back in 1976. Now, photovoltaics, on the other hand, has come down. And this curve is a little bit unfair because the Moore's law drop in the cost of electronics and the increase in power is over about 8 orders of magnitude. And in photovoltaics, it hasn't been that many. You have to go to the right-hand scale of the slide. It's been 2 orders of magnitude. But unlike oil, the cost of photovoltaics has dropped in the 70s from $75 a panel to something like 75 cents a panel today. And if you think about the future of photovoltaics, I'll be interested to hear what Paul thinks about this too. There aren't fundamental laws that say that that can't go on for some time. And so I think we can look forward to continuing price declines. It may flatten out a little bit, but people are clever, and engineers have been able to keep many of these things on growth curves, where as long as the volume grows, the cost will drop.
So
unlike oil.
Not quite Moore's law, but a couple orders of magnitude, pretty impressive.
Yep.
That factor of 1,000 that Paul mentioned over the last even more years, 5 decades or so, pretty much.
That's right. It's all consistent. Yeah.
Wow. You've got another slide that indicates, this was quite a surprise to me, how big the photovoltaic industry has become.
Yeah. So this is interesting that if you compare photovoltaics with some other industries that you might have paid attention to, or maybe I pay attention to them anyway, things like the semiconductor electronics market, which is a globalized worldwide business. It's about a factor of 3 smaller than the semiconductor electronics business, but photovoltaics is the largest optoelectronics industry in the world now. In fact, it's just now passing the flat panel display market. So everyone has a flat screen on their iPads and in their
right here in my lap.
Their screen.
Yeah.
And now the photovoltaics industry is growing faster than the flat display market. So it's really become this worldwide industry. It's gone from being a jewelry business, a tiny insignificant business a decade ago or a little more, to being this huge bricks and mortar paving business that's a worldwide industrial muscle.
Amazing. I want to get our third and final guest up here now. He comes at solar power maybe from a slightly different but very complementary angle. J.R. DeShazo directs the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA. He's also a professor and vice chair of the Department of Public Policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs. He is an expert in economics, public finance, and organizational governance. Dr. DeShazo's recent research has included climate change solar energy policy. He advises the Los Angeles City Council, the LA Department of Water and Power, the Metropolitan Water District, the Los Angeles Planning Department, among others. His work also supports the California Air Resources Board in its effort to implement AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's just what he does in the neighborhood. Dr. DeShazo has also advised the U.S. EPA, the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Union, the Ford Foundation, and the National Science Foundation. You get the idea. Please welcome J.R. DeShazo. Welcome, J.R. We'll get, Dave will get your microphone set up there. You brought along some slides as well. And I wonder if we could start right here at home. Basically, as Carole King said, up on the roof. Let's take a look at this one that is centered here in Pasadena. And this will take just a moment. Poor Dave, he's got to do things on stage and backstage as well.
So Matt, what you're looking at is a map of the solar rooftop potential, the physical potential of the Pasadena Water and Power service territory, extending southward to Los Angeles. And essentially what we did is we used a Google technology to measure the rooftop potential for hosting solar across Pasadena for single-family homes and businesses and government buildings as well.
So these are what, flat or south-facing rooftops? Or?
Well, these are all rooftops that could generate or host at least a kilowatt of capacity, so down to very small amounts. And what we did is we adjusted for the angles, the shading, and the shadowing, and all the fire codes that have to be attended to when you install a solar system. And what we wanted to do was give the public and give utility managers a sense of what the physical capacity on our rooftops were that was available.
This says so much about the importance, the usefulness of gathering data like this, and we'll get into that more later, but let's go to the next one that zooms out to all of LA County.
So we were fortunate enough to have good data on Los Angeles County as a whole, and the resolution becomes much more coarse, but you can see essentially where there are concentrations of essentially large warehouses or where the potential is the greatest. And it's more diffuse where there are single-family homes in places like Pasadena.
Now, the next slide is kind of the punchline to all this. I
Yes.
found it kind of staggering.
Yes. So the next thing we did is we took that map of LA County and we asked within each utility service area, what was the solar hosting capacity, just focusing on rooftops. So this doesn't include ground-mounted solar that could be installed in LA County. And the total physical potential is 19 gigawatts for the county, just rooftop. And Edison has the majority of that with, and then DWP half as much. But even DWP has 5,536 megawatts of capacity. DWP's generating capacity right now is 7,200 megawatts. So, a little more than 2/3 of their generating capacity could be solar in principle. Now, the important thing to recognize about these numbers are that one of the things that we should view these as really long-term supply potential of solar from rooftops, because we weren't able to really control for the quality of rooftops. We weren't able to identify property owners that might plan to sell their buildings soon. A lot of the buildings that have the highest potential for generating solar are commercial, retail, and warehouses. And so this is the physical potential and the technical potential, but it doesn't tell us what would be economically feasible at this point.
Okay, so the key word being potential then. So this is somewhat idealized. But even reducing that to a reasonable amount that would be practical if everybody had the money and we had enough installers, it's still pretty impressive. I mean, starting with that figure at the top of 19 gigawatts and change, that's 19 good-sized nuclear or coal-fired plants, right?
Right, absolutely.
Wow. So we're going to talk about what stands in the way of achieving this potential, but again, that's later this evening. There are a lot of facets to talking about solar. We've talked so far about solar electricity mostly that is produced on a smaller scale, close to where it is utilized. But there's another model, and Harry, that Time Magazine article that you were quoted in last week, talked about some gargantuan plants, solar farms, I guess that's the right term. You brought along a picture of at least one of those, or are there two of them in this next shot?
Yeah, well, that's right. So this is an aerial photo of a large solar farm. In fact, at the time it was commissioned, it's the largest solar farm in the world, called the Topaz Solar Farm. It's operated by First Solar. It's an American company. And so this illustrates that although there are three sectors of the solar market, there's residential that JR was talking about, commercial rooftops, which is part of what JR was looking at, but then there's also utility scale. And right now, utility scale is the largest part of the market and the largest part of the generating capacity. And a few years ago, these solar farms were permitted and project developers began to develop. And there were a couple of hiccups along the way. Some of the companies that were supposed to supply the panels went bankrupt and got taken over. But in the end, these have come to fruition, and they're producing really staggering amounts of electricity. For example, this one farm produces 550 megawatts of electricity. So a good-sized single power plant. So you can really think of it as the power plant equivalent. It's 4,600 football fields, if you want to put it in another context. So these are really, really large arrays. So it just illustrates the scale that's possible.
So I think there may be some disagreement about this next point that we can get into, but the question is, do these centralized plants, do they make good economic sense? Obviously, these companies think they do.
Yeah.
JR, you want to jump in?
Well, if you talk to a utility, they'll tell you, if you're going to make me do solar, this is the way I would like to do it.
And this is very close to their traditional model, right?
And one of the reasons for that is it is the cheapest way of generating a kilowatt hour of solar electricity. So when I started focusing on this about 5 years ago, this farm would have produced, if it was built then, solar at about maybe 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And now today, a farm like this would probably produce it at 5.5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour.
Sounds cheap.
And it would be cheap were it not for the fact that 5 years ago, natural gas was about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and now it's in the 4-cent range. So the fact that natural gas costs have fallen make it difficult for utilities to embrace solar the way that I think they were headed for when natural gas prices were quite high.
Paul, I want to get you in on this in just a moment, but first, Harry, back to you, because the next slide here has, I think, may encapsulate some of your thoughts about this.
Well, so I guess with regard to costs, I think you can also think about the curve I showed earlier with the price of oil. It went up and went down. And the same thing will happen with the price of gas. In fact, the reason that the whole solar industry took off in the last 15 years is because the price of gas spiked about 10 years ago. Right. And that drove a lot of the investments in solar that is coming online today. So the thing that you can predict about the fossil fuel prices is that they'll be unpredictable. And the thing that you can predict about the price of solar is that it will monotonically decline. And the calculus of that is pretty inexorable. You can look at this slide here that shows some bar charts from the Department of Energy. The pink or magenta bars on top are the costs of the solar panels over 4 years. And you can see there's tremendous decline in the cost of the solar panels themselves. Now, the solar panels are the panels that you've seen on the rooftops that were shown in the pictures that you showed at the beginning. But to make a solar system, there are a bunch of other things. You have to have people that install them, people that inspect them, people that permit them, people that wire them up to the grid, and so forth. And the costs of those are not coming down as rapidly. And that's, at least in the United States, that's one of the challenges. And if we can really punch through that challenge, then we could really see a big impact. But I'll point out the figure down in the lower right of the slide there that illustrates that if you look at the year 2014 and look at the total generating capacity that was added in the United States for power plant generating capacity, 36% of the added generating capacity was solar.
I thought, okay, I'll join that. I think that's an accomplishment. Paul, big centralized plants versus rooftops near where the power is being utilized. Where do you come down?
I think it has a lot to do with whether there's already a transmission line near where you want to put the large power plant. If you already have that and it's not fully utilized, then it's not a bad idea at all to put a large plant close to that. If we have to start building new transmission lines out into the desert to accommodate new solar plants, it takes a lot of the cost benefit away from that. I think it's interesting that it's such a flat playing field right now. The cost of putting a solar system on a roof of a home is maybe 50% more or so than what it would be to put it out in an open field, which is not too much different from the difference in the value of the energy. It's obviously more valuable to deliver it to the end user than to deliver it somewhere far away and where it has to be transported to the end use. This sort of broadening has been responsible for the fact that we've had utility, commercial, and residential scale systems evolving more or less in parallel for at least the last 10 years. My personal feeling is that ultimately solar is a distributed resource, and so you'd think that in the end game, using the solar as a distributed resource is in fact going to turn out to be the most cost-effective approach.
So it may make more sense now than it might in 20 years, let's say. Now, I have a personal bias here because my son-in-law is a biologist who has to walk the path of those transmission lines before they're built, documenting any endangered species. So I guess I'm not going to let that influence me. I'll leave it at that. JR, you wanted to get in on it again.
Well, I was just going to add that solar. The solar farms, one of their drawbacks is that they're a space hog. They require a lot of land, and usually the developers like to scrape the land before they put the panels on it. And so there are conservation and biological impacts to local ecosystems there. And then, as was pointed out, there's the cost of transmission and the transmission losses associated with getting the power to where it will be consumed. It is more controllable and that's valuable, as we'll probably discuss later on. The concern right now in California by the electrical systems operator, the independent system operator, is that we're going to have too much solar in, say, 2021 on a Sunday afternoon when we're not consuming a lot of power. And there's a little bit of fear-mongering going on there because it's hard to turn solar off, right? But large systems you can disconnect. In terms of distributed solar and rooftop solar, whether it's on a home or a business, the politics are interesting because local policymakers, your mayor, city council, they like local solar because it creates local jobs. Environmentalists like local solar because it allows them to take responsibility for their own emissions and their own green power and do something that sort of makes a difference. And depending on the kind of solar procurement program you participate in, you're contributing your solar energy to the broader community, and they like that. So there are these other kinds of value and economic development benefits that come with more distributed solar. And then the other thing that I think will emerge over time is, we live in a place that's vulnerable to earthquakes, and you can create these energy sanctuaries if you can couple solar or a distributed renewable with batteries. So that people, if they were stranded for 2 or 3 days because of an earthquake, could bring their medicines and charge their cell phones and their breast milk that needed refrigeration or what have you to a centralized location. And I think in terms of emergency preparedness, there's a vision for the region that relies on distributed generation as well.
We're going to get into storage and into the challenges to the existing grid in just a few moments. But before we go on, Harry, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that it's not either or, utility or residential. It's all of the above. I think we're going to see all of them grow. I am in violent agreement with JR and with Paul that the model we're seeing for the growth of utility scale solar versus residential now doesn't really reflect the cost decline. It reflects the utility structure that we have at the moment. We have basically a broadcast, to put it, power system. We don't have a power internet. We all know how going from broadcast communications to an internet communication system changed our lives. And we're not yet over the hump of getting to a power internet. Yeah. When we have it, we're going to have a lot more choices and flexibility about how we deploy solar in a distributed fashion.
Love that metaphor. I hope we can come back to it. Very briefly now, I don't want to take a long time with this, but what we've seen so far in these big centralized plants is really just a scaled up version of what people have on their rooftops. But there's another kind of big solar generating station that, you know, a lot of us in Southern California have seen a great example of. The biggest example of as we make the drive to Las Vegas. We've got a shot of that here. I'm talking about Ivanpah, the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System on the Nevada border. There it is in action. Thousands of mirrors focusing white-hot solar heat on boilers at the tops of 3 towers. You can see at least one of them in that shot up there. Steam created up there runs through turbines, turning generators, just like a traditional, you know, coal-fired or natural gas, or for that matter, nuclear plant. Paul, do you see an ongoing role for this kind of solar power?
Well, I think the devil's in the details. You know, solar thermal and electric versus photovoltaics have been competing with each other for a long time, decades. And from decade to decade, one has the upper hand over the other one. I think it's pretty clear that right now photovoltaics has the upper hand relative to solar thermal electric. And it comes down to simply the fact that, you know, these big mirrors have to be kept clean and they have to point exactly in the right direction. And that's not so easy when the wind blows, for example, or when they get hot and they start to distort. So it comes down to subtle engineering details that are currently the difference. I would say there's no fundamental science that says that photovoltaics will always be better than solar thermal electric, but that's what I think is the situation now.
JR, Harry, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think one of the things we were just talking about, the granularity. In fact, you can't build an Ivanpah plant on your roof. And
I could try.
And so there's an intrinsic scale you need. Basically, you have to match the size of a big GE turbine or something like that to run, have enough thermal power to run a turbine that puts out energy efficiently. Small-scale turbines are less efficient than large-scale turbines. So there's an intrinsic scale issue. That feeds throughout the whole project financing scheme. You have to raise a lot of capital. You have to build a big project, not like just putting solar panels on your roof.
Yeah.
And just to reiterate the reliability benefits of photovoltaics, anything that moves, that has cranks and gears, is going to be subject to maintenance and significant repair, but PV isn't. And so you avoid a lot of that.
Yeah, no hot corroding steam or anything like that. Back to the grid. We started to touch on this because there is pretty good evidence. Some of it just came out in the last few days. That the traditional power suppliers, the utilities, are increasingly nervous about the distributed model of power generation that is coming on strong, largely because of, you know, the proliferation of rooftop panels. Do they have good reason to be anxious? JR?
It requires an organizational change and a cultural change in how they think about what they're doing. They are used to controlling a handful of generation resources, mostly natural gas and coal, that are dispatchable. They can turn them up, they can turn them down as the amount of power needed changes. And they own and build and control those. The distributed renewables like wind and solar are not dispatchable. You can't control when they come and when they go away entirely. And the fact that they're distributed and they might be on property that is not utility-owned property means that the way they think about their network and their transmission and distribution system has to change. And one of the things that has to change is they don't have what the utility guys call visibility to the end of their circuits. They really don't know. Most of the utilities that service, businesses and homes, they don't know what's going on at the end. They monitor substation activity and they keep the distribution system balanced. But to really accommodate solar, and they need to have greater visibility. They need to modernize the grid. So they can, and essentially it's deploying sensors throughout the networks. So
finer resolution, greater granularity.
So part of their fear comes from ignorance. They actually don't understand and can't control their own distribution network very effectively. So that's part of the problem.
Paul?
Well, an interesting sidelight to that is the utilities have been particularly nervous about people having what we call self-consumption, where the power gets generated on the roof and gets used in the house without ever going out through a meter and then back again. Because then, as JR pointed out, they have even less visibility into what's going on at the end of the line. And I think there's one of the reasons you see some of the utilities are being a bit cautious. But the way I look at it is, the telephone companies used to provide telephone service. It was a broadcast mode. Now, almost every telephone company I know of is if they make money at all, it's by being internet service providers. I think the electric utilities have to sort of envision themselves making a similar transformation.
I have read that Hawaii may be the first state that is really coming up against this. That rooftop photovoltaics have become so popular there that they really are presenting a challenge to the grid.
Well, there's also, in addition to the operational challenges we just referred to, there's a business model challenge. The technical term is if you net meter, if you install a system and meet your own annual needs, most of those programs require that you pay only a monthly connection fee of maybe $10 and then some other small fees. And so the utility has essentially lost you as a customer. But you're not off the grid. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize. You are still, when it's a cloudy day or when the sun sets, you return to being dependent on the utility to receive energy from its transmission and distribution system. And so that utility still has to hold generation capacity to meet all of its customers' needs, even the ones that are no longer officially customers because they've net metered and installed solar. And so there's a conundrum. When you do net meter, you stop paying the utility for its services, but you still require the utility to basically become an energy banker, to give you energy when you need it and to receive your energy, your surplus energy, when you generate it. And we haven't quite figured out the economic model financially to make the utility whole, because the other ratepayers who aren't able to install solar have to cover all of the fixed cost of all the wires and all the generating resources that supply you with power during the night and during the day. And then the last operational challenge right now is because we don't have great energy storage technologies, when the sun goes down or when the sun comes up, you have to adjust the other energy generating resources. And in most cases, it's natural gas turbines, and you have to adjust those quickly. And the utilities they're only becoming used to the idea of needing to support solar with that natural gas generation. And that's new, and it requires a change in the generating resources that utilities have.
Harry?
Yeah, I think it's likely that in the sort of mid to distant future, utilities are going to become energy insurance companies. Essentially, they're going to ensure that we have a certain quality of service. And just like your insurance company on your home or your auto or your life insurance, they have to get paid somehow. And we have to make sure that we don't engage in what some people have darkly referred to as the possibility of the utility death spiral, where the consumer is generating all their own electricity. The utility has this massive fixed cost of infrastructure to maintain to make sure that you can have surety of power but no source of revenue. So we have to deal with that. But I also wanted to point out that there's some really interesting innovations that are coming along that are being driven by information technology that have real potential together with this coming power internet. There's something called demand response. Basically, we have intelligent wireless meters like the ones on your laptop that are going to listen for signals. They're going to listen for signals about the price of electricity. So the California Independent System Operator is going to be able to broadcast the price of electricity to your washing machine. And when your washing machine decides it's time to arbitrage your washing your clothes, it will do so.
I don't know. My washing machine is already too smart.
Okay. Well, but you won't even have to think about it, Matt. Your washing machine will just do what it does, and it'll save you money, and it will smooth out it'll mitigate the uncertainty in the grid. And if we manage this, and at Caltech we're developing through the Resnick Institute some research programs that focus on the question of how do you manage that uncertainty on the grid using mathematical models of complex systems. And guess who the people are that are doing it? It's the computer scientists that develop the models of the internet.
Fascinating. Paul, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is this something that your area, your center, or others at NREL are also looking at, making this transition?
Actually, NREL has a fairly large program in what we call grid integration of renewable energy sources, and demand response is a key part of that. I might add that, a few months ago, someone came up with this statement that they had figured out that their aluminum smelter could be a huge grid-scale battery storage. But what they really meant was you just implement something like demand response concepts to a very large load, like an aluminum smelter. And in essence, then you just, you turn it on when there's the sun shining, and you turn it off when the sun's not shining. And in effect, you level out the use of solar power on the grid, with potentially just one or two really big loads like that doing the work.
Huh. JR, you talked about the need for certain transitional steps when we were talking on the phone a few days ago. You mentioned natural gas playing a role in this.
Right. Well, as I was saying earlier, one of the things that utilities that want to integrate a lot of solar or wind need to do is better understand and better develop the ability to, as the sun goes down, ramp up that natural gas capacity right now. If we had large energy storage capacity that was cost effective, we could overgenerate solar or wind during the day or night, store it and use it in those periods where the resource wasn't being generated. But we're not there yet. And I think that for many sustainable energy buffs, that's the holy grail, is to develop energy storage, because that smooths out and that gives you lots and lots of options. But we're not there yet. And the state of California, the governor, just a few weeks ago announced basically a new renewable energy portfolio standard goal for the state. Pushing us further than we are even now, and pushing the utilities into a territory where they're going to have to think very creatively and reorganize their generating capacity. And one of the problems that utilities have, and it's a practical problem, is sometimes they sign long-term contracts for power. Sometimes these contracts are 30 and 40 years long. So the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles has a lot of coal still relative to its neighboring utilities. And one of the reasons for that is because they signed a long-term contract to receive energy from those coal plants. And so we may go through a period where we have to add more flexible natural gas resources, turbines that ramp quickly because we have more solar and wind. And we still may have some of this older generation capacity around. So, and that's more expensive in a way that we didn't anticipate, because it's not just the cost of the renewable energy systems, it's the other systems that have to complement it that we also have to add to the mix. And that's a little challenging. And Spain has gone through that experience recently.
You mentioned storage. I want to thank you for the nice segue into our next topic, almost as if we had planned it, because people may not know how much brighter the solar future is, as we are discovering in the discussion this evening, but they know its major limitation. Harry, you had a great term for it that you used on Take Two earlier today. I think you called it predictable intermittency or something like that. Basically, it's what happens when the sun don't shine.
Yeah. Well, so the way I like to think about this is that right now we're finally getting to solar 1.0. We're getting to the point where photovoltaic solar power is being generated at a large scale, a scale that's really tangible to everyone. We've just been talking about all of this tonight. I think of solar 2.0 as being dispatchable solar. So JR talked about the need to have gas turbine plants that can pick up when the solar drops in the nighttime, or perhaps clouds come over or something like that.
Those gas turbines, they can turn on quickly, unlike the old steam turbines.
That's right. So we need sources, and we need actually, it's not a single type of storage. You can, for example, you can pump water relatively inexpensively as a source of storage of electricity, but you can't dispatch it very rapidly. So if a cloud comes over, you need to be able to dispatch electricity in seconds, not in minutes to hours. So we need a sort of a hierarchy of storage solutions. Fortunately, there are innovations in this area coupled to demand response that I think are going to allow us to get to essentially this solar 2.0 vision where the penetration of solar energy into the economy is going to go much further than it is limited just by the intermittency at the moment.
So your institution, also Paul's, are doing a lot of work in this area. In fact, there's a little piece of a video that I found on the NREL video site, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that Paul is speaking to us from right now. I want to start with this little segment about hydrogen.
Scientists in NREL's photoelectrochemical hydrogen production lab
We have the world record for efficiency of solar water splitting.
are using solar energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen to create fuel.
We're sticking our photovoltaic material directly into solution and shining light on it, and you get hydrogen right off of the surface.
It is one of the cleanest ways to produce hydrogen, but it's not the only method.
The photobiological hydrogen production is one of many alternatives that are being considered as hydrogen producing technologies.
The photobiological process relies on organisms like green algae or cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, to split water and generate hydrogen.
Biological organisms do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis basically is the same process.
Inside this building we have two electrolyzers that produce hydrogen from water and renewable electricity.
The Wind to Hydrogen project at NREL's National Wind Technology Center is exploring ways to use wind and solar energy to harvest hydrogen.
These systems in here are electrolyzers, and their main purpose in life is to take in electricity, preferably from renewables, and split water into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is compressed to higher pressures and then stored in tanks.
This is just the dawning of hydrogen as a fuel source in our country. Today, hydrogen powers a relatively small number of buildings and vehicles, but the potential is limitless.
We're standing in front of a hydrogen fueling station, and it dispenses gaseous hydrogen into vehicles.
So that little tiny desktop propeller going around up front reminded me remarkably of the one that I ran when I was 11 years old. I just skipped the hydrogen middleman. Paul, any comments on what we just saw?
Well, I mean, a lot of the things, admittedly, there are sort of science experiments, as you point out. I, for one, think it's probably not necessary to stick the photovoltaic device in the water. You might as well just have a cheap panel and stick it on your roof and then run some wires down to the water to split it. But it's a good proof of concept that you can take ultimately sunshine and turn it into hydrogen. It's a lot more efficient than photosynthesis at present by about an order of magnitude. And if you need a way to store electricity, hydrogen is one way. I would say batteries are clearly still another way, and they have the lead right now.
Harry is going to tell us more about artificial photosynthesis in a moment, but there is a much more prosaic, more mundane possibility for storing energy. And Paul, you have a series of slides and animation that illustrates this.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how we're going to work this because I can't see those slides from where I am.
Well, I'll try and keep you informed, but we have the first slide up now.
Okay, so if you'll go to the next slide. What is this? This, in Harry's, referred to this hierarchy of storage solutions. I've sort of taken this as at the most personal level. In other words, if you had to solve the storage problem yourself as an individual, how would you do it? And so I said, well, okay, how would I do it? I would put PV on my home, maybe about 4 kilowatts is typical, and I'd make sure that my employer, which is this picture on the upper right, also put PV on the roof of my place of work. And of course, that's going to be bigger, and maybe 400 kilowatts is more typical.
So that's
now.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, that's Cloudy Friday. Should we go on to the next one?
Oh, you were way ahead of me already.
Oh, sorry about that.
The point here, though, is people, a lot of people, at least in California and even here in Colorado, drive electric cars, and they actually have a reasonable amount of energy storage built into them, much of which is not really used on a regular basis because you build electric cars with a lot of extra battery capacity so people don't get what's called range anxiety, and worry about going flat while they're out on the highway. So you have all this energy storage running around on the highways that's not being used, and if you could use that to store PV energy, you would actually have something. So now I'm on Cloudy Friday, and when I say go, click the next click, and then I'll try to talk you through this. So you ready for this?
Yeah, we're set.
Okay, so we start out at the beginning with the home battery is not quite full, the car battery is not quite full, and this is a worst case scenario where we're starting early in the morning, 6 a.m. on a Friday, and it's going to be cloudy today. Okay, so hit go. Okay, you drive to work, you get to work, you plug in your car, it charges during the day, and even though it's cloudy, one nice thing about PV is it still on a cloudy day produces 1/4 to 1/3 it would normal. Car gets charged up, you drive it back home, and now you plug it into your house. So come nightfall in the evening, you can actually power your house off of your car's battery, and it turns out that that's entirely feasible in terms of the amount of energy that's stored there. Next morning, this is a Saturday, so we have this problem. We're not driving to work, so we don't have access to the big array at work. So we start wondering what's going to happen. But again, because on a cloudy day, you still get a reasonable amount of energy. You use more energy than you gain, but you're not too bad off by that evening, although your car is starting to get a little bit weaker. And now we get to the next day, and same problem's happening. It's a Sunday, and again, this time we're not driving to work, so we have to say, wow, are we going to make it? It turns out, if you do the calculations, sure enough, by that evening, the house is going to have used up a lot of its battery capacity, and by the next morning, the car will also have used up most of its battery capacity. But after 3 cloudy days in a row, you still end up with a situation where you're not flat on the batteries either in the car or in the house. Now, if you hit go to the next slide. So if it turns out that the next Monday is also cloudy, well, at least you're driving to work. It turns out that under the cloudy skies, you'll still get enough off of the array at work to charge the cars of the employees because workplaces have large roof spaces. Admittedly, the employer won't get to sell much electricity to the utility that day, but they do manage to give this benefit to their employees, probably at some cost to the employees, or else maybe the employees see it as a benefit, kind of like free meals at Google or something, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you hit the go on the next slide, if, of course, you get a sunny day, then everything's fine, because there's more than enough total energy production in this scenario to take care of all the needs. So if you look to the last slide, I really think legitimately there would only be a few brave individuals that actually dare to try to do this and completely disconnect their homes from the grid. I mean, it would take guts to do that, frankly. But I really think that there might be some early adopters out there that would do this. And the thing that's occurred to me is it only takes a few people to do this to keep the utilities honest. If they actually see that it's possible for people to disconnect, then they'll provide grid connection services at a reasonable price for everyone. And so actually, I think the vast majority of people will choose to connect their PV systems to the grid and use that.
And that worked remarkably well. Thank you for narrating that. It stayed right in sync. Let's look a little bit farther out. As I said, in that video, Harry, we saw the barest bit of introduction to what is known as artificial photosynthesis, which you have a slide about.
Yeah, well, so you showed at the beginning of your introduction, Matt, the Bell Labs solar battery. And I think it's fair to say that we're, just beyond the beginning of that Bell Labs solar battery with respect to artificial photosynthesis. I just wanted to say a little bit about work that's going on at Caltech on artificial photosynthesis. This I think of as being solar 3.0. So I talked about solar 1.0 as providing lots of cheap electricity. Solar 2.0 is dispatchable electrons. Solar 3.0 is chemical fuels from sunlight. Why is chemical fuels from sunlight so important? Well, there's a whole part of our economy that is producing CO2 every time we use it in the transportation sector that is very tough to electrify. So if anybody gets on an airplane, you can buy a carbon offset, but you're still creating a lot of CO2. In fact, the CO2 per passenger mile is very large compared to other forms of transportation. So long-haul trucking is another example of something that's going to be tough to electrify. So there is a real reason why we use chemical fuels now. They're incredibly compact, energy dense. When you go to the gas station and fill up your car, through that plastic hose that you're using to fill up your car at the filling station, you're putting the equivalent of several megawatts of power through that plastic hose that costs about $5, right? So that tells you how energy dense and convenient chemical fuels really are. So what if we could do this in a way that didn't involve fossil fuels? We break the connection between fossil fuels and chemical fuels. We make renewable chemical fuels. So the way to make renewable chemical fuels, Paul talked about one, which is to split water to make hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very energy dense fuel because it's so light. Hydrogen has some disadvantages. It's tough to store. It embrittles metals and so forth, and people are working on that. But what about that plastic hose at the gas station? That classic plastic hose at the gas station is pouring liquid fuels that are compatible with your gas tank and cheap materials like the plastic hose. Can we make chemical fuels like that? Well, at Caltech, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis is working towards developing water-splitting devices that produce hydrogen, like the ones that Paul talked about. And very important, just as Paul mentioned, he prefers to put his solar panel outside the electrochemical solution. And the reason I think that Paul probably prefers that is that he thinks it would probably be a lot more stable that way. It's more likely to last for 20 or 30 years and so forth.
He's nodding, yeah.
But we've been able at Caltech, at the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, to make some breakthroughs recently that allow us to stabilize those electrochemical cells so that they live a lot longer than they ever have. And so we're seeing the first sort of glints of possibility that we'll be able to make devices that could last notionally as long as solar panels. But the real prize is to emulate photosynthesis. Photosynthesis doesn't make hydrogen. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and water and produces stored chemical fuel in the form of starch in a leaf and generates oxygen. Could we do that? Could we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And at JCAP, we're working on devices that can literally reduce CO2, not sequester it underground as CO2, but chemically
Not just
convert
hide it, but
right.
make use of it.
And it's an enormous challenge. I have to not deceive you and mention that it's really in the basic research stages. But we feel that this is a risky, if I might be so bold as to say, Caltech-worthy problem to study how to reduce CO2. Because ultimately, we're all worried about carbon emissions. Some of us have given up hope about the possibility of limiting carbon emissions. But I'm motivated by the notion that we might actually be able to reduce carbon emissions.
And this is
it's
a catalyst-driven
That's right.
process.
It's catalytic, just the same way that the water-splitting cells are catalytic. But instead of taking water and producing hydrogen and oxygen, take CO2, a Perrier water notionally, and produce alcohols or methane or something like that, which are the chemical fuels that we have in our fuel sector today.
JR, you have been extremely patient during the last few minutes of...
Have had nothing to say.
Well, but you will now, because while we have talked about this tremendous technological potential for the future, there are other hurdles that have to be overcome, not just perfecting artificial photosynthesis. What are the most pressing needs that you are dealing with policymakers and elected officials? What's standing in the way of not just this kind of development of new technologies, but adoption of what we have in place?
Well, the most obvious answer is cost. Solar generating capacity has fallen tremendously in terms of its cost, but it's still significantly more expensive than the natural gas or coal at their current levels. Now, as was pointed out, natural gas and even coal, but mostly natural gas, has a high degree of variability, but ratepayers are going to be asked to pay more. Not only because the solar systems cost more than other kinds of the natural gas or coal, but because we need more capacity that complements it, going back to the natural gas idea. So cost would be one factor. And in municipally owned utilities like Pasadena and Los Angeles, it's very hard for a utility that's governed by an elected body to raise rates on itself. That's a difficult thing to do. So cost is one issue. We talked earlier about the organizational and cultural challenges that utilities as entities which have been around for 60 years doing exactly what they've always been doing for 60 years, face in dealing with distributed generation. There's often a labor issue there as well, because many of these new distributed generation resources are privately owned and supplied to the utilities, so they're not utility built. Right? So there's capacity now that's being built by non-utility labor, which is a political issue, and it's an important one. But I think the bigger issues are that these utilities, I mean, we have two, renowned scientists with us tonight. The utilities really don't have the organizational capacity right now to develop sensor networks and optimize their systems. And it's a software problem by and large. And it's so that I think that's one of the greatest challenges that they face is just developing, modernizing their grid, deploying some new sensors, adding new generating capacity to complement renewables, and then the other part that we've talked about is perhaps they need a new business model. It's not entirely clear to me that what that's going to look like, right? We really don't have any models out there right now that are similar to the one where you provide electrical services of a certain, or insurance. So I would say cost, organizational transformation, grid modernization, those are probably the three most important ones.
But you do spend an awful lot of your life talking to policymakers, helping to guide them, talking to elected officials.
Yes.
Do they get it?
Well, what tends to happen is, and we have a great example in California. California is a wonderful state to be a researcher who loves and cares about these things in, because we have elected officials who, without really knowing anything about the technology, will set what we call these stretch goals, these aspirational goals. So our governor said, we're gonna go 50%, renewable, or reduce our carbon intensity by 50% by 2030.
We will put a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
15 years from now. He has no idea how we're going to do that, right? And yet that's what we do. That's what our elected officials do. It happens at the mayoral level, the city council level, the county level, up to the state. That's what our electeds do, and that's what we pay them to do, is set these aspirational goals for ourselves. And then the scientists all say, well, of course we can do that. We have the capacity. But the question is cost and organizational transformation. How quickly can we all adjust to those two things? And the utilities and the independent system operator and the ratepayers are kind of stuck in the middle. And there's this whole apparatus that tries to adjust to these new stretch goals. And the truth of the matter is, we're making progress. We're learning a lot about what we can do, how to do this. We're pushing utilities out of their comfort zone. It's happening slower than most of us would like, but in the larger purview, it's happening fairly quickly.
Harry, you've got one more slide that gives us an example from another nation that seems to be handling this pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask the question, can it be done? And what can be done? And so, for example, JR just talked about the aspirational goals that politicians set. And in fact, the classic example of that spurred the entire photovoltaics industry is the feed-in tariff in Germany,
right, that
spurred this dramatic cost reduction and manufacturing increase in photovoltaics. And one of the things that has done, so for example, in the last 5 years in the United States, PV has gone from 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%, to about 2% of the electric generating capacity. So how far could it go before you start encountering these problems with storage and intermittency and so forth? And I think it's interesting to look at Germany, which hasn't had a radical overhaul of its electric system. There have been higher costs, as JR talked about, but they've been able to add 50% to their peak, or 25% of the total generating capacity on good, resource-abundant, renewable resource-abundant days. And so there's some data here that just shows the yellow peaks in that data on the top curve show that, so Germany is about 80 gigawatts. That's their total electric generating capacity on the grid. And so they produce about 20 gigawatts from solar on a good resource day. So one of the things also that's kind of interesting to note is that the experience of going to large-scale solar in Germany has driven down the cost of not only this large scale, but also residential solar. In fact, in Germany, a lot of the solar that powers the grid is residential rather than these big projects. And the cost of the panels is the same. That's the bottom dark blue bar in the chart at the bottom of the slide. The cost of a photovoltaic panel is a commodity worldwide. It's the same cost in Germany as it is in the United States. So what's the difference in cost? It's the cost of the permitting, the utility, the regulations, the installation, the inspections, the maintenance, and so forth. And in Germany, for example, to install a solar panel, instead of in the United States, you have to have a bonded electrician. The rules are different in every municipality. In Germany, you download one form from the internet, and your electrician, who is not a bonded solar installer, can install it. And so that means that the cost of an installation. So that's a vision where we can go. Another vision, for example, is in Denmark, where they've pledged to go to 100% renewables by 2050.
Wow.
That's another one of those aspirational goals. Fortunately, in Denmark, they have a lot of wind power, and they have a small country, and they have a good chance of making it. But I think these examples are powerful.
Yeah. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that UCLA has a grand challenge for thriving in a hotter Los Angeles, which is, and part of that, the energy portion of that is what would it take to move us towards 100% renewables? And all of these issues come up there. I would be remiss also when we talk about Germany without pointing out two things, right? Most of us in this room are probably paying between 18 and 20 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And the average household in Germany pays about 65 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a lot.
Expensive.
It's a lot more expensive, and their equivalent, their independent system operator that manages their grid, does get this surplus power on a Sunday afternoon, and they have to push it out of the country. They push it south to France, and they push it to the Nordic countries, and those guys don't like it. And it's creating these international kind of challenges. So there's solutions to all of this. And what's fun is to watch some of the learning pains that go on, right?
We've talked about that grand challenge at UCLA on this stage when we talked about climate change and its effect on Southern California. Paul, when we were talking on the phone a few days ago, you talked about the role China has played in this, not the overhead, bringing that down, but that reduction in the cost of panels.
Yeah, so, Harry mentioned that Germany instigated the major growth in PV. If you look at how it's transpired, the U.S. put something in the order of maybe $2 billion into R&D in solar before the rest of the world even knew what was going on. But then Europe came along, and they put about $10 billion into the development of PV and sort of took the center stage away from the U.S. at that point in time. Well, China came along, and they've invested essentially $50 billion in the development of photovoltaics, with a particular focus on supporting development of manufacturing. Is there going to be a next step? Is someone going to step up to the plate, and put in $100 billion, as the next one? It's hard to see the U.S. doing that in the current political environment. It could happen somewhere else. India makes noises recently, and is capable of such a thing. I think that the thing that's impressive is that, if we hadn't had this progression of one-upmanship on the political stage, PV would not be where it is today. We probably wouldn't be having this forum to discuss, the bright prospects for solar. And it's because the price has come down, because the scale has grown by so many orders of magnitude, and it requires different governments to keep stepping up to the plate and saying, we want this for ourselves. We're gonna take it, and we're gonna make the investment necessary to do that. I'd love to see the U.S. be the next one, to completely take it over, and they could do that. But the investment is, like I say, it's $100 billion. It's nothing to sneeze at.
JR, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. I just want to say we're headed into the home stretch here in this evening's edition of Next, People Science Tomorrow, talking about solar energy, of course, with our three wonderful panelists. And that means we're going to get in just a moment to the portion of the program where we turn to the audience. So if you have a question in mind, be ready to raise your hand, and somebody will be coming over to you, if you're lucky, with that microphone. So be prepared for that. JR, I want to let you respond.
So I just wanted to amplify what was just said about the role that China plays and add in a few other factors. The headline here is that our solar panels and our solar installations right now have a lot of benefits that may disappear in the future that drive the cost down. So China is subsidizing the capital and the financing of these panels. So we're getting a product at reduced cost. And then when it gets here, the federal tax credits reduce further the installation cost by a little over 30%, maybe more than that, depending on how it's structured. There's also, if you're a commercial entity, a depreciation tax credit that can be another 10 to 12% on top of that. So the solar panels and the installations that we're putting up right now could be subsidized in terms of their real cost by as much as 50%. And that could go away, as was discussed earlier.
Well, it is going to go away, isn't it? Part of it at the end of 2016?
That's right. So the ITC, the investment tax credit, is set to expire in 2016. And that 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour solar number that I gave you before is made possible by that tax credit and the depreciation and the cheap Chinese panels. So this is a dynamic economic environment that, we've had a lot of breakthroughs. Even the economics of installing these panels have improved as firms become more efficient in how they use laborers, and the balance of systems and how those things get constructed have come down. But still, it is a technology that's benefited in this moment from a dramatic set of forces that have made it very economical. It wouldn't surprise me if in 4 or 5 years we saw a rebound of even 20 or 25% in the cost. It will continue to decline long term, but there's some very powerful forces at play right now.
Harry, if you want to get in a last word here before we go to the Q&A.
Yeah, I think that what you're seeing here is that there's lots of uncertainty, but there's also opportunity everywhere you look. So it's very, predictions are very difficult about the future, Yogi Berra and Niels Bohr and all of that. So in fact, it was an uptick in the price of photovoltaic panels that stimulated a lot of the investment in the current industry, because a lot of companies saw, hey, this is a profitable sector, we're going to dive in. That generated an oversupply. So, and this is extremely reminiscent of what happened in the early days of the semiconductor industry. It went through a 6-year cycle, boom-bust cycle. And I expect that we'll see some up and downs in the photovoltaic business, but those are also reinvestment cycles. And the overall story is that the cost will come down. And I don't see it plateauing or going back up asymptotically. I think that we're going to see overall cost declines, and just the math is very simple and axiomatic, that we're going to see in some countries solar is economical now because the high price of electricity. The US from that perspective is one of the most challenging markets for solar because we have the world's lowest cost of fossil energy, and outside of Saudi Arabia, for example. But we're extremely economical. The business is coming here because of it. And it won't always be so. And there are lots of forces involved in this, but the technology driver is still not finished, I would say. One of the places is efficiency. Today we've been talking all about cost. We haven't talked about the efficiency. We have a project at Caltech to drive the efficiency up from the 15 or 20% module efficiency that we enjoy now. We asked not why is that efficiency so high, but why is it so pitifully low? Why is the efficiency not 93%, the Carnot efficiency of a heat engine exposed to the sun? So we easily see the possibility of getting to 40 or 50% module efficiency.
And you're getting ahead. You guys are great. You're on top of things. That's where I was going to end up when we finish the conversation this evening. But before we run out of time, let's take a few minutes to go out to the audience. So those of you who have questions, raise a hand. Looks like we might have a first person right here, maybe? Hi, sir. What is your name?
My name is Paul Scott, and my question is for JR. JR, when you're talking about cost, the external costs of dirty fuel are never calculated in. These are just out there. And when you compare renewable energy to dirty energy, it seems to me that those costs always need to be on the table, at least in discussed.
Great point.
You're exactly right, Paul. This is in fact why our politicians keep setting these aspirational goals, because the social damages of fossil fuels are not priced into those fuels. No one faces those when they decide how far to drive and how much hot water to consume. And so we focus on creating this transition to renewables. You're exactly right.
Paul or Harry, did you also want to address that? No? Otherwise?
Yeah, that's, no, go ahead. Yeah,
That's it?
yeah,
Okay.
I agree completely, yeah.
Good enough.
I would add that, when you talk about costs, it's always difficult. I mean, one of the costs in PV is the cost of financing. Well, where does that money go? Well, it goes to some financial institution, which then returns returns back to people who probably have their 401k plan invested in that. So it's very difficult sometimes to trace where the money's going. And when you talk about money that's a cost that ends up circulating back into the economy, which is often the case with solar, versus a cost with a fossil fuel where basically you're just paying somebody to dig something up and burn it. I don't think you're comparing apples and oranges, and I think that it's another case where you have to be very careful about what you mean there.
Let's get to another question out here in the audience, the other side here of the Crawford Family Forum. Hi, sir. What is your name?
Hi, my name's Evan Dorn. I recently installed a solar array on my rooftop.
Good for you.
Thank you. And when I was designing the system, I learned that grid-tied solar systems go offline whenever the grid has a power outage, which seemed kind of silly to me that the sun would be up and my food would still spoil in my fridge despite 6 kilowatts of solar on my roof. So I asked about hybrid systems that also have a battery backup as part of their as a component of the system, and was told that those are actually against the law in California. Because of laws to protect the solar company from competition. Is there any chance of that changing soon? Is that something that's being worked on?
Somebody needs to tell the singer Jackson Browne that he's liable for arrest because he's off the grid on his ranch. There was a documentary about this, and he's got a little shed full of lead acid batteries. So I guess he's a felon in making. Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm guessing that it's not so much that it's illegal, but that the concern is that the utility workers working on your circuits near your home wouldn't be protected in an outage. And that's why your system goes offline when there's an electrical outage. The energy sanctuary idea that I suggested before, where you put solar on a library or a fire department with battery storage, the reason that's precluded by electric code right now that the utilities go by is because you can't protect electrical workers. You can, but the microgrid technology needs to be developed to the point where we have deployable code that protects them. I'm guessing that's the background story there.
Okay, we'll move on. Let's go to another question on the other side here. And hello, welcome. What is your name?
My name is Melissa. And my question is about those leasing companies that lease you solar panels. Is that viable? And is that for someone that's interested in investing in solar energy? I mean, I'm curious if that's a place to do so.
JR, for anybody who hasn't been hit up, by someone doing telesales or door-to-door as I was a couple of days ago, tell us what is that model?
So this is a model in which, well, let's start with the economics. So if you're going to put a 4 kilowatt system on your rooftop, you might pay, well, let's just say that you're going to pay about $22,000 to $24,000 upfront cost. And then there are rebates that are available and then tax credits and things like that. And so that was the case until about 5 years ago, that if you wanted to install your own solar system, you had to finance it yourself up front. And that's about the ball. It would have been more back then. And one of the financing breakthroughs were companies and solar cities, the sort of the most prominent example, figured out a leasing strategy in which they essentially come in and they put the equipment on your rooftop and they lease the services from that system to you. And they usually do so that it's just a little bit cheaper than your current power bill. So in fact, it might even be a little bit more, but it becomes cheaper in the future as your electricity rates go up over time from the utility. And thus you can save money. And the beauty of this is there's no upfront cost to you as a homeowner. And that's the leasing structure is sort of the way that works. And historically, well, and so for some people, well, for most people, that has made rooftop solar a viable option. It has really transformed the residential market radically. And I've seen estimates as high as 65% of the market would not have happened if it weren't for this financing innovation. And I think that's very true. Some of the companies that do this, everyone's sort of waiting, crossing their fingers, hoping they don't get in trouble with the IRS, because many of them size and price those systems so that they can take a bigger tax credit, because you get this income tax credit. And there's some question about, whether they're doing that appropriately, but as a financial innovation, it has made this a very viable market. And it's, if it's not important for you to own your system, it's something to look at.
I want to stop there and see if we can get one more question in before we wrap up for this evening. Sorry we couldn't get to more of you. Hi, sir. What is your name?
My name's Earl. Question about the producing side of it. We haven't talked about raw materials, and are there any scarce materials? Are there going to be pipeline issues as this industry grows, and the environmental impact of mining those materials?
Well, I know silicon is cheap, but Harry, you're working on
Yeah,
gallium arsenide, right?
Yeah, let me say that solar energy, like all large-scale industries, is going to have to embrace recycling with conviction. We can't have a P waste like we have piles of e-waste, where you have things that, your old electronics. The scale is just too large. In fact, we've already seen examples of this and whether or not you use silicon or another material. For example, First Solar uses cadmium telluride, which is a thin film material. And in fact, in order to be able to introduce cadmium telluride panels in Europe, they had to agree to remit them back and recycle them at the end of life. So built into the cost model for every First Solar panel is the cost of the remittance and the recycling upfront in the purchase and sale of the panel. And then I think they've turned what was a liability into a real asset to essentially do and they're very keen on life cycle analysis. And we're going to see, as the industry grows, there's going to be a lot of work on life cycle analysis. Making panels more durable is another way to tremendously cut the cost of solar. You can cut the cost of electricity in half by declaring that the lifetime of a solar panel is not 20 years but 40 years. And in fact, making panels that will last that long seems now a real distinct possibility. So I think it's like the growth of any large industry. We're going to see recycling, conservation, but also just continuous use of less material.
Paul, I want to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, I would point out that even if the existing industry did not grow any larger, and it just used the consumed input materials at the rate that it does today, if the panels last 20 to 30 years, then we will get to the point where PV is supplying more than 10% of the world's electricity. So if maybe we would like to do better than that. Maybe we'd like 50%, but that's maybe a factor of 5. So it's not that we have to envision that the photovoltaic manufacturing industry is going to somehow grow by a factor of 100, and where's all the material going to come from to do that? It's a modest and I think manageable problem to allow the existing manufacturing to grow by a factor of a few.
We need to wrap up, but I have one more question, maybe two. Harry, you started to address this. If I forced you to predict the future, against the advice of Niels Bohr, where do you think we will be in 20 years, 25 years?
I think we'll see a lot more reliable power grid that has a lot more renewable energy. A lot of it will be solar. A lot of the things we're seeing now are growing pains. I think we either will or will not come to a solution for large-scale storage of electrons. There's a lot of work going on that right now. That could be a game changer. I think we'll see the distinct possibility that in my children's lifetime, people will look back and say, gosh, those silly people, they set fire to hydrocarbons to generate electricity. And that would be an outcome that I certainly look forward to.
Paul, you get to go next. 20 to 25 years down the line.
I like Harry's visionary approach, and we need more of that. I'm an engineer, so I'm a little more pragmatic, but I really do think that in that time scale, PV will be a part of a mix that undoubtedly will also include wind and perhaps a little more small hydro, so that renewables I'm going to say they're on the range of 50% of the total electricity generation in that time frame. I think we'd like to see it be more, but I suspect it's a little further out than just 25 years.
JR, if the scientists and engineers do their part, where will
I
we
think
be?
every new building will have integrated into it photovoltaics or whatever the most competitive technology is for solar, and they'll consume a quarter of the energy they currently do. I agree with the vision. I suspect that the people in this room and the scientists and will focus on doing in-runs around the utilities and make buildings as efficient as we can in terms of generation, storage, and utilization consumption, because that's what we can control. And the utility system, I think, will improve. It won't take a lot to make it vastly more efficient than it currently is. So I'm extremely optimistic. 20 years is a long time, given how rapidly things have changed just the last 5 to 10 years.
So we end on a very optimistic note. Gentlemen, we are out of time. I do want to thank once again as you would no doubt agree, 3 outstanding panelists this evening. They are Paul Besor of the National Renewable Energy Lab, Harry Atwater of Caltech, and J.R. DeShazo of UCLA. I'm also very grateful, as always, to the folks here at the Crawford Family Forum, Southern California Public Radio, who have once again made this evening very rewarding and very easy for yours truly. They include producer Janice Wachi-Hurst, technical director David McKeever, Haley Waters, Ashley Alvarado, and Liz Brown. And then there's SCPR's managing producer of forum programs and live events, the man who always brings a ray of sunshine into my life, John Cohn. We want to leave you with one more uplifting vision, and in this case, I really do mean uplifting, quite literally. As we speak, solar power.
And here we go already.
It might just inspire more nations to consider how the sun sustains
And we're in the air.